Do you want to know what the fallen are, little one? In a sense, they are angels, but not the angels your mom imagines she prays to. Brass trumpets picnicking in the clouds. In their true essence, they are great swirling engines of wing and blood, fiery eyes that peer around the corners between worlds. Dark, radiant things conjured from fresh battlefields. A Frankenstein's Valkyrie, forever crashing to Midgard. What grief demands their hate? What vast cannibal hunger?
Welcome to the Fallen Cycle. This is a universe full of secrets, waiting for those brave or foolhardy enough to seek them out. Tales from When I Had a Face was written by James Curcio, with editing by Brian Johnson. A modern fairy tale about death, loss, and finding redemption in the strangest places, for those of us still haunted by the uncertain, occult logic of dreams. The soundtrack features the work of David Bessel, along with contributions from Jen E., P. Emerson Williams, and James Curcio, from the archives of past Mythos projects. Support for this project is pivotal. By becoming a patron at patreon.com/mythosmedia, that's MYTHOS media, you enable us to make more content like this, and to be able to hire on more freelance artists in future works. You can also discover more about the Mythpunk Fallen Cycle universe at fallencycle.com. This podcast contains adult themes and may induce psychosis. And now, this week's episode, Season 1, Episode 7, of Prophecy and Desert Sand.
We sailed over seas of sand, the skids lightly kissing the flat road that their frequent passage carved through the dunes. Windships did not so much fly as glide, although when we launched off a particularly high dune, we would remain aloft for some time. And the view was magnificent. I was reminded of long, beautifully lonely nights riding in the tundra, with the blue-black egg of firmament overhead and nothing else in the universe but the whistling of the wind, the quiet contemplation of the stars. I could see greater dunes arcing and falling off to the west, but for the time being, we sailed north. Imari crew deftly darted around the rigging, adjusting the sail to make best use of the wind. The horned moon rose behind them as night crept her way into the kingdom of heaven and pushed the sun from the sky. I was sitting above deck beside Eluane. Nisa basked overhead in the young moonlight, which she claimed tasted best, swaying in the rigging like a flower in the breeze. The ropes creaked as the boat gently rocked back and forth along with her, its hull suspended from above by a balloon made of dried pig gut. Elena remained sequestered in the cabin. When I left her, she was combing her hair with an Imari brush, looking out the port window with a pregnant quietness that I saw descend on her sometimes when she thought no one was watching. I had left her to her thoughts and returned above, with the intent of learning from Eluane what I might. He was smoking from a bone pipe. In between puffs, he would occasionally fall to introspection, until again continuing to speak at length of arcane puzzles that I had only started to understand. During the pauses, we would sit together as the twilight desert whisked past, he looking off to the horizon, and me looking at him. He spoke for some time about the cycles of the moon and how it was connected to the procession of the ages, trees, seasons. But then he would refer to them again as worlds, and again as special people who could be discovered through prophecy, thus recapitulating the cycle of the seasons. "None of your words mean quite what I expect them to mean," I said. "Altaran is bound to seem strange to you, though it is far less strange than it once was," he replied. I leaned in closer and found the smell of the herbs he was smoking curiously sweet and off-putting. I changed the subject. "Are you so sure about what Elena saw, and do you trust her to be honest with us about it?" She was a high-strung girl, I thought to myself. Who knows what really happened in that alley, or if she had been there at all? Eluane pointed up at the sky. "Do you see that star? The one that pulses again and again?" "Yes," I said. He agreed. It is like a single winking eye, red as glowing coals, then blue as the noontime sky. For 1,000 years it was constant as the sun. The Imari set their caravan paths by it. But shortly before I came looking for Elena, the Tovag One Eye had a vision. He said one day soon, this distant star would flicker, erupt like a bonfire in the heavens, and vanish. Then, that hungry star will overtake the minds of all the mortals who dwell here, spreading like a plague from one city to the next. I watched it, hypnotized. And now its pulse grows irregular, he said. It seemed to vibrate right through me as I watched, a pulse that synced with the blood throbbing in my veins. Before I could reply, Eluane shook his head and waved his hand for quiet. He rose to his feet and gazed skyward. Did you hear that? At first, I wasn't sure I had. A vibration rose in my chest, a thrum. Something darted around out there in the empty spaces between the dunes. Nisa dangled from the rigging above, her hair blowing in the wind, seemingly unfazed by the noise. I called out to her in shock, for that is when I saw them. The stuff of nightmares was taking form, and I would not later be able to say which was real and which was dream. They moved too quickly at first to get a good look, hornet-like, thick as my thigh, and angry as hell. They had iridescent carapaces that shimmered red and purple, blue and yellow, spindly legs, wings, and eyes within eyes. On their heads, yes, but also lining the bottom of each one's abdomen. They swooped in and strafed the mast, picking off any Imari who hadn't already swung like acrobats to the deck below. Everything burst into motion at once. One hornet buzzed close beside Nisa and then pivoted and lunged for her exposed throat. She slid down from one rope to the next with surprising agility, avoiding the stab of stinger and grasp of mandible. Another Imari plummeted from above her in the rigging with an open-mouthed, silent scream, like a fish gasping at air it cannot breathe. And then there was nothing, except the hornets veering down upon him and his fallen comrades, paralyzing them before a second scream could escape their lips. It was better to imagine them like drowned seamen, drifting gently to the bottom of the ocean in the arms of sweet asphyxia. Wallaj leapt in front of me, jabbing at an enemy I could scarcely see. The spear connected with shell, but it glanced off and spun from his grasp. Behind him, I could see other Imari locked in mortal struggle with this horror that descended from the sky all around us. Wallaj shoved me toward the staircase to the lower decks. "Get below!" I slammed the cabin door shut with my whole body and stayed there a moment, breathing hard, feeling some reassurance in its solidity against my back. It was smooth and cool under my nervous fingers, a wood that had been polished until it was like silk. Nisa stood beside me, a thumb still in her mouth. She sucked on it absently, that wet clicking the only sound in the room, as the crashing and shrieking of battle and battering winds drifted down to us from above. Exotic birds eyed us from a cage across the room, eerily still and silent despite the commotion above deck. The forward cabin was laden with furniture, carefully carved by craftsmen who had lived for nothing but that purpose. The walls were lined with rows of alcoves that served as book repositories for the Imari, who ventured far from their central library, so they might bring back more than material goods. Elena had been sleeping in one of the bunks. These were larger alcoves, as if we were just larger books ourselves. She pushed the curtain aside. "What's happening out there?" she asked, yawning, her hair a predictable mess. I was having such horrible nightmares. It was as if I was caged in 1,000 people's sleeping heads, wide awake and aware the whole time. Do you know how strange other people's dreams are? None of the context makes sense. There was a loud bang, and a voice shrieking into the night, then falling again into an uncomfortable silence. "Keep your dreams to yourself next time," I said, at the same time hoping the battle might be contained and she wouldn't have to see what I'd already seen, or what we were being spared from seeing just then above deck. I felt the door rattle under my fingers and only registered pain a moment later. Just a sting at first, it spread quickly, spiderweb fissures in ice, alternating cold and white-hot. Like the pulse of a miniature heart, Blood welled from the wound, along with a darker fluid that seemed to make my skin numb wherever it touched. That hollow needle must have penetrated 2 inches of solid wood to reach my soft flesh. I staggered from the door. It was flung wide, and Walaj stood there, one of the insects pinned to the ground by his spear, its legs still thrashing in a losing battle with death. We called out to him in unison. "Is all right," he said, raising a hand. More buzzing and howls rang out behind him. "Are you sure?" Elena asked hopefully. "No," Walaj said, slamming the door shut again. By this point I was feeling dizzy, and Elena had started crying. I staggered toward her, repeating his message. "Not all right. Not all right." Again she asked for reassurance in between sobs, but I couldn't stay on my feet any longer. I collapsed in the middle of the room. "You're bleeding," I heard Nisa observe, more with curiosity than concern. "Oh," I said, now daring to look. It was an angry gash in the back of my thigh. Surely not life-threatening, I thought, though blood was still welling from the wound. Still my eyes were dimming. I knew that something was deeply wrong, although I couldn't quite place it. "How can a dream become real?" Elena asked no one in particular. The last word had a curious ring to it, as if she didn't understand what the question meant. "I've been poisoned," I gasped. "Is that real enough?" Sweat stung my eyes, but otherwise my body felt far away, like it belonged to someone else and they had returned to claim it. Nisa crawled over to me, reverting to wild instinct. Before I could protest, she grabbed my leg and began sucking. I could only watch. Still in her bunk, Elena said, "Nisa, that's gross. Stop it right now." Nisa drew up and splayed razor-sharp claws in a bird-like provocation, hissing. The eyes that regarded us were milky white and devoid of humanity. Elena gasped and stepped back in horror. "What are you doing?" she asked. Nisa pulled herself away from me with a great show of will. She licked her chin, still dribbling red as if she'd been playfully rampaging through a strawberry patch. "Human sap tastes sweet," she exclaimed. When she returned my gaze, her eyes had reverted to their normal bright green. "I was thirsty's all," she said with a half-apologetic smile. Feeling returned to my leg with astonishing quickness. Warmth seemed to flow with it, as if this strange creature had done even more than remove the venom. Just a moment before, I was preparing to make my peace with death, but she must have imbibed a considerable amount of the stuff. "Nisa," I asked weakly, "do you feel well?" She shrugged and let out a tiny burp. "You had dirty water in you, dirty water, and crunchy eggs." She smiled brightly, but after burping uproariously again a few times, she wandered away. "Eggs?" I asked after her, to no reply. I felt slightly nauseous. Elena flopped back on the covers in her bunk and made like a child making a snow angel, except she wasn't enjoying it, not for 1 minute. "I'm going to die in this wretched desert with 2 freaks," she huffed a moment later, her arms now crossed tightly across her chest. She glared at me with such dramatic intensity that I began to laugh, and then she glared more, until the 2 of us were in hysterics, laughing on the floor, kicking the boards and howling with glee. Not a minute later, we were holding on to one another, sobbing because we had almost died and everything we had ever known was gone. And all we had was this temporary family of outcast strangers fate had thrown us into. It was one of the only times I ever saw her cry. Just then, while I was still rubbing my eyes and wiping away snot, Eluane entered the cabin with Sama and Walaj hurrying behind. Walaj dragged an Imari man by the waist who was groaning and mumbling to himself. "Mother, no. Mother, don't return us to the ground." "His name is Ulkan. He's been in my crew for many years. Now I fear his service is at an end," Sama said as he lowered him gently to the floor. Sweat beaded Ulkan's brow, and his robes hung open, clinging wetly to other parts of his slack form. Still he mouthed again and again, "Mother, mother," until his voice grew silent. Eluane was already on his knees, placing a metal bowl on embroidered fabric he had rolled out in front of him. He placed a twig on the corner furthest from him and went clockwise, adding the cracked skull of a small animal and a polished rock. The final corner remained bare. Meanwhile, Sama was tearing open Ulkan's blood-stained robes. With another rip, the flesh underneath was exposed, and Sama gasped in shock. Ulkan's abdomen bulged and pulsed unnaturally, a lump the size of a grapefruit squirming inside the point of injection like a trapped animal. Black fluid leaked from this new cavity. Even Eluane grimaced. Sama gestured toward us, saying, "Look away." "What?" Elena asked. "Look away," Sama hissed, a dagger now in hand. Then his voice took on a resonance that filled the chamber, and he seemed to regard the empty air. "You are free, free to tell your tale to the Raven Wanderer." Without warning, he plunged his knife downward with savage force, but Ulkan made no sound, save a final wheezing gasp. Too late, we covered our eyes, and a heavy silence spread through the cabin as a stain soaked through the carpet at our feet like blotter paper. Eluane looked back to Sama, who was wiping his blade. "Now we'll need to push onto 4 corners, swiftly." "You want us to take you to a party?" "Sure, why not?" Sama said dryly. Walaj grabbed hold of Ulkan's now motionless hands and began dragging his body toward the door. "Do we still have the crew to make it?" Eluane asked as Walaj reached the door. "If you come with me and help," Walaj affirmed. "When I am finished in my task," Eluane said calmly. As he reached the threshold, Walaj suddenly dropped Ulkan's arms, letting out a hiss of surprise. We all turned towards him, but he only stared in shock at the body splayed at his feet. "What is the problem?" Sama asked. Before Walaj could reply, Ulkan's body jerked violently and then struggled to rise with the clumsy yet weightless grace of a puppet. His slack face remained that of a dead man. Without hesitation, Walaj leapt into action, grabbing his spear from the ground and plunging it deep, skewering the thing that walked in Ulkan's skin. Something chitinous and alien seemed to peek out from the wound, but it did not move. We waited in excruciating silence to see if he would rise again. I didn't particularly want to ask what I had just witnessed, as each of the possible answers I could think of seemed worse than the one before it. Finally satisfied, the 3 of them left the cabin, Ulkan's mangled body in tow. He would receive a desert burial, along with the others who fell that night. Eluane dabbed some of his blood on the bare corner of the embroidered cloth. Then he lit a fire in the brazier and began to write. The crest of the moon buried itself like a pike into the mountains that emerged from the clouds to the west. The windship carried us ever northward in the direction of the Great Divide, a purple gash of rock that split the horizon as wide as the eye could see. I'd later discover the entirety of the highlands to the north were seated atop this expanse that merged land and sky, though we still coasted amongst the dunes many days south of that wall of stone. In the black heart of dusk, specks of white on the horizon gradually blossomed to a dull orange glow. Clustered around these lights, I could see gare tents, and about them, rows of tethered windships swayed together like trees around an oasis, enjoying a gentle breeze. We glided closer and moored amongst the other ships. We disembarked as hot air escaped the balloon above with a long, loud hiss, quickly lost in the summer air as the sounds of the encampment before us grew in volume. 4 Corners was not a fixed location. As Sama explained, it moved with the shifting sands, although always more or less equidistant between the tribes who made their homes south of the divide. Outsiders were welcome, but it was their party. The Imari and Mibari, whose lands would soon become partially known to me, came from the west. For the others, I have only stories to piece together and fit behind the faces so briefly shown to me in flickering firelight. Our guide passed through the encampment as if it were the set for a play, and he was the director taking us on a tour. So we heard of the nomadic riders from the east, of Trepa and Aturi, now few after so many incursions and so much infighting. Still, they were swift and fierce, unwilling to vanish entirely into the uncharted grasslands, and never return. From the marshland delta of the south ventured watchful representatives of the free city of Orman. Ever mindful of the periphery of outsiders at their northern borders, they were most of all enforcers of the common god that transcends all local deities, coin. As they are wont to say, all money is blood money. However, it was partly through the stability of their city-state that the South as a power came to be. Orman was its heart, much as Imari trade was its veins. From the north, he explained, came the few Chernayans that were brave, greedy, or desperate enough to venture to the origin lands beyond the edge of the world, to which they still applied words such as savage and barbarian. Many of the other faces spotted in the flickering light also seemed to be from worlds and times beyond this one, both near and far. Out here, in the barren desert, they would meet for this event. A city of tents blooming under the light of a full moon. For that moment, it bound these people together like the hub of a wheel, from which all the spokes radiate, and from which their equilibrium depends. The symbol upon all their tents was of 4 rays joined by a circle nearly meeting to form a cross with a hollow space. It was said 4 corners was that space, a symbol of the second world as a whole, the antechamber of life and death, the crossroads of time. Then, somewhere out in the desert, a gateway would open. Only the Imari were adept enough to find it. On the other side was always somewhere different. Every last tent would be gone again come morning, receding as the moon shrank, a hazy recollection lingering in that secret place where dreams are most turbulent. A great bonfire raged amidst the gathering, the central star in a constellation of fires. As we approached, I could hear the beating of drums and voices calling out into the dead air of the desert. I had the impression that all the sound of their carousing was a memory, that they were but ghosts returning to commemorate the eve of a distant celebration. We could now see dancers and musicians, hundreds of them, all moving languidly between those stars, each free, but responding to the unseen collective rhythm. Most would feel the tug of trance and the call of the other side, but not clearly. I was beginning to sense the patterns, the warp and weft of this world, so alike and yet so different from the one I had left. If only Eluane would teach me. The energy of this place grabbed hold of me and almost immediately lifted my spirits, carrying me forward in the process until I was nearly jogging. The young prince began clapping his hands to far-off music, and I recognized there was an incredibly intricate rhythm at work. A hush seemed to fall on the crowd as we approached, though I quickly saw the silence was not for us. They brought a female gazelle before the central fire, half drunk on some concoction, still braying and struggling madly against the throng that carried her, and with a final shout, they casually slit her throat. Her life's blood pooled on a silver plate, and the men howled at the sky as the women dipped their hands in it, painting their faces and breasts like braves preparing for war. This was merely the opening ceremony, and I could feel a sense of eager anticipation surge through the crowd. Everyone turned toward one another, and an ecstatic smile, spreading like some virulent contagion, seemed to presage what was to follow. But instead, at that very moment, a flash tore across the sky. Brighter than any star, briefly brighter than even the midday sun, and this was clearly not what they had been awaiting. It seemed the silent explosion of far-off artillery fire shot across the heavens. The entire crowd froze in place. At first, we were paralyzed in confusion along with them as the glare slowly faded. We shared a kind of blind elation, uncertain of what we had seen, and some beat their drums and thrashed all the harder, their devotion to ecstasy redoubled. But this was just as quickly replaced with uneasiness. That, in turn, became fear. Dancers cowered and covered their faces. The musicians wept or shook their heads as they stared dumbfounded down at their hands or up at the hole that seemed to have appeared in their familiar night sky. I heard a murmur spreading amongst them. "Ashanti's star. Where has it gone? Can you see it?" Everyone interpreted it differently, but everyone knew that something was deeply amiss. Eluane turned in place without a word, leading us back toward our tethered windship. We followed him with quick, anxious steps. Behind us, we could hear their murmuring grow ever more urgent, then panicked, and then shouts, and the sound of conflict reached our ears as we pulled ourselves aboard our vessel. We couldn't get that ship in the air fast enough. "This changes little for us," Eluane said once we were underway, still looking over his shoulder at the dimming lights. "A council will be called when we reach Ashanti." "How many remain after your last failed rebellion?" Sama asked. "Those still alive will not respond." "We have to try," Eluane said. Walaj was still frowning at the sky and the hole where the brightest star had once shone. There, in that void, appeared a new light, a comet, its head white as her skin, its tail red as her hair. It shone faintly at first, but gained brightness, seeming to draw its strength as if from that very darkness that had shrouded its approach, and the other stars seemed to vanish from the sky around it, swallowed up by its brilliance. Silence followed us as we rode westward into the deep desert.
Gran clucked her tongue. Then she cupped a hand over her chest as she spoke. Their hearts were empty. Ashanti's star never rose again. In its place, a gnawing hunger, as the summer tree once again grows. A void at the center of the night opened like a great eyelid. Her comet shone in that black pupil, and in its path those who resisted her would forevermore know despair, degradation, and destruction. She raised that closed fist into the air, and then suddenly the fingers sprang open, like a tarantula sensing its prey.
The next day, those not on duty remained below decks, but Sama stayed above, his hands on the rail, his gaze turned upward toward the sky. I joined him. After some time sitting in silence, stroking the wood at once thoughtfully and absently, he turned to me. "What do you know of me and my home?" he asked. I felt suddenly shy and realized this was the first time I'd had his full attention. "Only what I've gathered," I replied vaguely. I took a step backward without noticing it, and then stopped myself and leaned against the rail as well. He didn't move to bridge the distance, but smiled. "And what might that be?" I considered what to say and decided to be completely honest. "You are proud but not cruel, for one with such privilege and power as a prince. Kind, in a slippery sort of way. You value knowledge. I've watched you reading more than anyone on this voyage, except maybe Eluane. But we are in dangerous lands, and you're not quite so soft as you seem." "You are an observant young woman," he said, apparently pleased with my choice of words. "So what do you want to know? You find me handsome, is that it? You think maybe you talk to me, spend time with Sama, and things look not so bad for Ayta, eh?" "You're pretty enough," I said, glancing his way, and then shrugged, looking back toward the expanse of blowing sand around us. He seemed to be toying with me, but not unkindly. "Pretty?" he said with another practiced smile. I shrugged again, but then smiled with him. He exemplified his people's common traits. His skin was burnished bronze, his features were fair. Lithe of build, with little body hair, he seemed to take great pride in the sliver of mustache that darkened his lips, and he stroked it often. He was constantly in motion, with a kind of grace that I found a little unsettling. "One day I'll want to tell this story, and do it justice," I said, holding myself in a way that I knew men liked to see. In truth, I had little attraction to him. His handsomeness and poise made him seem facile to me, generic, but somehow this made flirtation easier. To his credit, Sama caught on immediately. He took a seat on one of the benches near the prow and bid me do the same with a motion of his hand. "This I understand," he said. "Imari, we are all gifted storytellers. Sit and let me tell you of my home, and you may judge it by my words as well as what you see when we arrive, yes?" He swept his hand out toward the desert around us. I settled in beside him and closed my eyes. "Forgive me if this gets too long for your taste. The wind alone knows how much I'll have to omit, so we needn't sit here 100 years. My father's father's father, countless times removed, was one of those who first called their tribe Imari. Before then, I am told they were known as the Essel. The first world turned to desert around them, even as the oceans rose, and they disappeared from the tales and remembrance of the earth. Imari means family. Never from those times on would you hear of an Imari not treating another as family. Others might fight, but we would just as soon disappear and leave our pursuers to their fate. Our life then demanded absolute commitment to one another. We lived where no one else could, thriving as long as we kept moving. This life demanded that we relearn everything, or die. Our luck only changed in earnest when a lost caravan returned, their parched tongues speaking of following the star of the dawn sky. They claimed a paradise grew at their journey's end. Following their tale with some understandable skepticism, a group set out and went far into the deep desert. They expected a dry hole, but found a lake of pure water, fed by warm vents deep beneath the mountains, surrounded by rosy quartz canyons and plateaus. Animals and birds came from all around, bringing with them nuts and seeds that nurtured the gardens we would soon ourselves cultivate. We changed when we found this Ashanti. No longer wanderers, we had a true home. Is this not what we all want? A home and family we can depend on, a place in the world, a reward for honorable service. The less blessed tribes of the south, such as the Mibari, naturally found their place with us as abdals, artisans, courtesans, and guards, and they have no small talent for it. They show us honor, and we return it. A terraced city formed, as if the material accumulation of that mutual goodwill. My family's palace was built from a natural plateau face that shades the shores of the Nadia. Chitilian sages visited from the crystal city near Ayta, and they brought our site further into focus. We collected knowledge, and thus the library was born. And we built the observatory, so we might gain portents from the subtle relations of the lights above. Much we borrowed from Eluane's people, and so he is always welcome with us, and one of our dear friends. He remembers the Chitilians as they were, a last link to that vanished world. Many of my people now fear him, as his kind were feared throughout the north, but I find his presence restful. They're gone? I asked, interjecting for the first time into his story. He frowned. He calls on the dead as his brethren once did, of course, but no. Maybe this is for him alone to share. My own people were driven into the mountains or killed, I offered. I have no people now. Yes, you came here as an outworlder, Sama said, though his eyes hardened. He was suddenly far less talkative than he'd been a moment before, almost surly or perhaps shamed, and we sat in silence for a while. The wind whipped our clothes about as we looked off toward the distant city, though all we could see was the endless desert and the craggy mountains beyond. I do not envy Eluane for his task, he said, before letting out a long sigh. He gazed up at the comet, which seemed to hang like the bauble of a mobile, suspended from cords clutched by an unseen hand somewhere far above our heads. Dark times are ahead, he muttered, but then his features lightened. With a wink and a half-smile, he headed toward his room to the fore of the ship.
That's all for this week's episode. Stay up to date with upcoming episodes by subscribing at fallencycle.podbean.com or wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. Check out the work of the contributing musicians. Those links and additional information is available in the text provided along with this episode. This audio edition was produced by James Kershaw, along with text-to-speech synthesis. A statement on the use of LLMs is available on our website for those curious about how we do and don't use these technologies. This podcast is Creative Commons 3.0, Attribution, Share and Share alike, non-commercial use.